Hi guys, and welcome back to another video in regards to motorbike maintenance. Today I'm going to show you how to replace your brake fluid and the tools that you'll need and a few little tips that will help you along the way. So, as we talked in the last video and was doing the checks over the motorbike, I discovered that the fluid on this bike was low and it's also looking pretty dirty. Now to me that means that it needs replacement. It either hasn't been done since factory or it hasn't been regularly serviced. So the thing that I'm going to do now is show you a list of the things that you will need to help you achieve this in the easiest way possible. So here we have all the things needed to help us change our brake fluid. We have a old sheet or dust cover to put over the paintwork, because brake fluid can leak when you're taking components off and it's very aggressive on paintwork. So it's easier to throw that in the washing machine or in the bin than it is to get your tank repainted. I've got the 8mm spanner, and I've also got a socket just in case the bleed nipple is shown to be a little bit tough. We've got some penetrating fluid just to help in case there's any corrosion. We've got the brake fluid. We've got some tools here to help take the reservoir top off, a rag for wiping up, a wire brush also to help with cleaning corrosion off, and a hammer just in case the reservoir bolts are slightly seized in. This will help shock them to undo them. We also have a pop bottle with a pipe in, which is what the brake fluid will be drained into. So the first thing I like to do before I get started into committing to bleeding the brakes is making sure that the bleed nipple and the reservoir will come open. In this case we have an 8mm bleed screw with a little rubber boot on the top of it. So what we want to do is remove that rubber boot. You can pull it to one side or completely remove it. If you have any excessive corrosion on here, it's always worth using a wire brush and just scraping that away first. Once you've done that, you can follow up by using a small amount of penetrating fluid directed onto the thread. When you're using the penetrating fluid, be careful to make sure you don't get this on your disc or your pads, because that could cause problems later on. So we're using an 8mm spanner on the ring end to avoid slipping. And as we come to undo this, if it's a little bit tight, which this one isn't, so we've got an easy job here, but if you find yourself being a little bit tight, tighten it up a little bit first, then undo. That helps break away any dirt, debris or corrosion from the thread. If it still persists on being stuck, move on to a hex socket on only, I'd say, a quarter drive ratchet. Anything bigger you could cause problems like shearing the bleed screw off in the caliper. And that means drilling, rethreading, or potentially a new caliper depending on how much damage is done. So obviously that could just slip over and undo, easy as that. And you'll notice you'll have a small amount of fluid dribble out just as it cracks open. Always make sure you wipe off any excess that flows around into unwanted places. So this is when we move on to ensuring that we can undo the screws on our fluid reservoir. In this case we have cross-headed screws. In most cases you'll see this, or Allen keys. Allen keys can be particularly a pain in the backside if they start to round off. So it's always worth checking this before you even attempt the job and getting replacement screws if necessary. Now, the important thing on Japanese bikes with the cross-headed screw is they're not quite the same as what you'd expect. In this case, what we have is called a JIS type screw. And we'll just go over to the board and I can show you the difference between JIS, Phillips and Posi-Drive. This is important because if you use the wrong type of screwdriver, you could chew the heads up and make a bigger problem for yourself. Now here on the board is demonstrating the difference between JIS, Phillips and Posi-Drive. As you can see, the JIS is just a straight cross. Phillips is a cross and it has a slight indented centre. And Posi-Drive has the cross, the indented centre and 4 extra biting points. These are commonly used for woodworking. So once we've established what type of fixture we have in the top of the reservoir, we use the appropriate screwdriver or Allen key and see if we can undo them. Now on this bike they seem to be coming undone very well. This can be a problem if they're not. So, as I referred to earlier, use the hammer on the end of the screwdriver and just give it a slight tap to give the threads a shock. Now, before going any further, before we open up the reservoir and have a potential spill of brake fluid, we want to make sure our paintwork's covered, so that's where the dust cover comes in. All you need to do is slot it over the tank and cross any bare paintwork. If you have fears that you might get some on your mudguard, a separate cloth will also suffice. So once the screws are removed and you've put them in a safe place, I recommend either using a magnetic tray, or if you don't have one, the lid off an aerosol. That can be put away on the bench or even inside the house if you're working outside, just to make sure that these fixtures don't get lost. So once the screws are removed and we have the bike covered, we can remove the first part of the lid. There should normally be a secondary part, which is a little rubber boot. This is to help maintain the fluid level as you use the brake. As we can see, this brake fluid in here is very dark, very dirty, and probably has a reduced boiling point. The next thing that we want to do is get ready to open the bleed nipple to help that fluid flow through. So get the ring end of your spanner and apply that over the bleed nipple first. Then we're referring back to the pop bottle with the pipe and put that over the bleed nipple afterwards. This just helps us make sure that we can undo this bleed nipple without any issues of rounding the bolt off. So once we're on, the pipe's connected, we can undo that only around about half a turn, and that should be enough. The bottles stay there, and then we can start pumping the lever. As you can see, the fluid is going to the bottom of the bottle. And if we apply pressure to the brake lever, we should increase the fluid going to the bottom of the bottle. Now, before we pump all of the fluid out, we need to make sure that the reservoir stays topped up. If we don't, this will introduce air into the system, and this will cause spongy brakes. It's also important to make sure that the brake fluid you use comes from a sealed container, because brake fluid is hygroscopic and takes in the moisture from the atmosphere. If you've got something that's been laying in the garage for around 10 years, it's probably a good chance it's no good. So don't doubt, just buy a new bottle. It's fairly cheap and can be bought from most supermarkets if you can't get to a parts factor. Now, you keep pumping your lever, checking your level every now and again to make sure you don't introduce air into the system until you can see clear fluid coming through. This will indicate that all of the old fluid is now out of the system. Now, once you're at the point where you feel that the clear brake fluid's coming through well at the bottom and you're about ready to finish up the bleed, what you want to do is ensure that the brake lever is pulled all the way in, and then you can go down to the bottom, get your 8mm spanner again and close off the bleed nipple. By pulling in the lever when you're closing off the nipple, that's to ensure that no more air travels back up into the system. Once you've done up the bleed nipple after holding the brake lever in, you can then release it, top up your reservoir, and you should be able to pull the lever and it have good resistance and not go all the way to your handlebars. This is showing that you've got no air in the system and that you've bled the system correctly. What you want to do next is go back down to your bleed nipple, make sure everything's tight and reapply your dust cover. So using the ring end of your spanner again, making sure it's tight, wiping any excess fluid off, making sure it hasn't gone onto your disc or into any unwanted places, and then refit your dust cover. These are just a stretch fit, small rubber piece, but they are important. They stop any dirt and road salt going into the bleed nipple, which causes corrosion and seizure. If your bike doesn't have any, there's plenty available on eBay or even at your parts supplier, and they're normally about £1.50 for a pair. Once everything's tight and refitted down at the caliper and you're happy that the lever travel's okay and that the fluid level's okay, it's time to refit your reservoir top. It's always a good idea to make sure there's no debris around the outside edges of this, so just give it a wipe down with a cloth. If there's any contaminants in the brake fluid, it could either go into the master cylinder and go through a seal, which could cause catastrophic problems. Last thing you want to be doing is going down the road and you hit the brake and it's not there. At this point, when you want to refit the master cylinder top, you want to make sure you don't have too much fluid in there. If you have too much fluid and you can push the top on, it could overflow and go into places where you don't want it to go and damaging paintwork. The easiest way to do this, if you don't have a syringe or any form of siphon, is just to use a piece of cloth and let it absorb a small amount out, but make sure that it is a clean cloth. Small dab like that takes out enough for the lid to go back on. Now, referring back to these screws that go into the reservoir top, this is why I put the anti-seize copper grease into the video. What you can get with a steel bolt going into an aluminium housing is a mixture of corrosion which makes things very difficult in the long term for you to remove. So, with a small scraping with a wire brush and a small amount of copper grease on there, things should be a lot better for you in the future. Now, you only need to go lightly with the wire brush. These can be a bit fiddly, and the last thing you want to do is attack it and fly it across your workshop. Once you believe the thread's clean, small amount of copper grease just on the tip of the thread. That'll work its way down as you screw it in, and do this for both bolts. With both bolts with the copper grease on, it's time to do the nut. Once you get to the point where you feel that they stop with very light pressure, make sure you do them up evenly. That ensures that there's a good seal on the top of the reservoir, so you don't get any leaks when moving your bike around. It's also important to make sure that you don't over tighten these. It can be easily done, and you can easily snap a thread off into the reservoir. Using the wire brush and copper grease can also be used onto the bleed nipple itself. If you've had problems removing it, making sure that it's all nice and clean to go back in will help you in the future. So, when you're all done, bleed nipple's tight, reservoir's done up, and you've got the correct amount of fluid in there, which is of a nice colour and good consistency, unlike the old stuff that you've just taken out. Give the bike a wipe round, make sure there's nothing in the wrong places, remove your dust cover, check your lever again before you go to ride and make sure it's not coming towards your handlebars, and then you're safe to go. Another thing I'll add is that some master cylinders also have a bleed nipple up the top. Now that's something that you do last, because that's to ensure that this has got no air in as well. On this system, it's just at the caliper. So, there you go, changing your brake fluid yourself. It's fairly straightforward, providing you don't run into problems with seed screws, that's including your bleed screw on the caliper. If you can prevent that, or even in a couple of days in advance, put some penetrating spray on there, it should help you along with the job. Now, doing this yourself, it's important to take your time. The last thing you want to do is rush something and get it wrong, or something that stops you when you're on the road. So, total cost for the job, providing you've already got hand tools. The price of the brake fluid that I got, which was in this circumstance Valvoline, I managed to get that from a supermarket. And it only cost $5.99. And that's for a 500ml bottle, which has been more than adequate for doing this job. Obviously, different brands, different places, also available to get the fluid. I always like to think that you're going and getting the fluid yourself to make sure that the bottle hasn't been tampered with or hasn't been shaken. If a bottle's shaken with brake fluid, it promotes aerated bubbles inside the fluid. That can cause issues on your braking system. Also, if the seal's been broken, it could potentially have moisture in it, which is also a problem. That lowers its boiling point. That's an important thing on brake fluid. The boiling point has to be remaining high. The lower it goes, you'll suffer with brake fade and spongy brakes. The more you ride and the hotter your brakes get. So, another thing added in, I use copper grease. That's something that I wouldn't say specifically for this job. That's something that you should keep into your little toolkit. It's handy for refitting bolts, wheel spindles, any moving parts that need to be concealed and tightened up. Obviously it's going to help with anti-seizure, which it's designed for, and it's also inexpensive. That tub I've had has lasted me nearly 6 years and it's still half full, and it only cost me £7.99. Now obviously you can get bigger tins, smaller tins and different prices, but for copper grease, something simple. Euro car parts do a good range. That's what I use there, it's triple QX. Obviously other brands are available. Now, the importance of changing your brake fluid. Why? Well, it stops you. The last thing you want to do is go for your brake lever and nothing happens. That's going to be a big problem. The main importance is checking that it's not taking in too much moisture and that its boiling point remains at where it should. So check with your manufacturer's specifications to what it should take. In this circumstance, it's .4. But 9 times out of 10, on the top of the fluid reservoir, it'll tell you the details of what you need to use. Even in some circumstances, the brand. So, in this case, there's no brand specific, but it did tell me to use .4, so that's what I used. Now, always make sure you go over your joins, seals, and everything that you've undone doing with your brakes before you ride your bike. The last thing you want to do is forget something and then something happens. Also, when replacing brake fluid, there's a potential that it can feel fine at the time, and then you go to it afterwards and it feels a little bit spongier than it did before. This isn't particularly something that you've done wrong, but it could be showing that there's a problem with the seal in your master cylinder. Now that it's been disturbed and done a full throw, it can pick up dirt and debris, or even a rusted plunger inside your master cylinder. So leave it to settle for so long, I'd say about half an hour, and then go back and check it. Providing it feels okay, job's a good one. If you've got a soft lever again, then you've got further issues. That is something that can be determined by clamping your flexible hose, providing that you haven't got a really hard, rigid or braided brake hose. Sometimes if you clamp a braided brake hose it can damage the outside, but providing you've got a standard rubber one, if you used to clamp it at the bottom, separating the two items, and you've still got that spongy lever, you've got a problem with your master cylinder. If you clamp it and the lever goes hard again, there's potentially a problem with either the lower half of your pipe or your caliper. But that's something that I can go into further detail into diagnosing into another video. So, it's cheap to do, it's good practice, it's good for your service schedule as well, and it also keeps you safe on the road. So, for a simple thing that costs maybe £10 at the most, if you don't have your tools either, you can go into supermarkets or even retail outlets such as B&M Bargains or Pound Stretcher. They'll sell a small selection of spanners, open-ended or even ratchet spanners for less than £7. I've seen these cases where you can buy a set of standard metric open-ended spanners for just £3.99. I'm not saying that they're going to be the best quality, but they might help you in just doing that little bit of learning if you want to do it yourself. So, do it right, do it yourself, have a go. Any doubts, consult a professional mechanic. But the most important thing is just make sure you do it right and stay safe. Well, that's it for today guys. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video and we'll see you again soon.